Viewer discretion. This story contains discussions of a suspected homicide and may not be suitable for all audiences. A husband says his wife slipped into the sea. It happened during what should have been a routine trip in a small dinghy, just minutes from the sailboat they called home. According to him, she vanished into the dark waters off the Bahamas before he could save her. For weeks, that explanation stood at the center of the investigation. Search crews combed the ocean. Helicopters flew overhead. Boats searched mile after mile of open water. But there was no sign of Lynette Hooker. Then, months later, something unexpected happened. The United States Coast Guard returned to the Bahamas, not for another routine search, but with specialized investigators, forensic experts, divers, underwater drones, remotely operated vehicles, and a cadaver dog. They worked alongside Bahamian authorities, revisiting the very waters where Lynette was last reported to have disappeared. This wasn't simply another attempt to recover a missing person. Investigators believed there was more to uncover. Public officials have not disclosed every detail that prompted the renewed operation, but they have confirmed that the mission focused on collecting evidence connected to the ongoing investigation. Even though Lynette's remains were not found, authorities described the operation as productive, recovering and examining evidence they believe could help determine what really happened. So the question becomes, what changed? What caused investigators to revisit a case that many assumed had already been searched as thoroughly as possible? Was Lynette Hooker's disappearance the tragic accident her husband described, or did new evidence begin pointing investigators toward a very different conclusion? To answer those questions, we have to go back to the beginning, before the headlines, before the search boats, and before an ordinary evening in the Bahamas became the center of an international investigation. First, we need to understand who Lynette Hooker was. Before investigators began piecing together timelines, analyzing electronic evidence, and searching the waters of the Bahamas, there was a woman whose life extended far beyond the headlines. Lynette Hooker was a Michigan native, known by friends and family as hardworking, adventurous, and deeply devoted to the people she loved. For decades, she built a career with AT&T, where former coworkers remembered her as dependable, approachable, and someone who brought positive energy into the workplace. According to those who knew her, Lynette wasn't the type of person who stayed idle. She enjoyed taking on challenges and embraced new experiences, even in careers and hobbies that many would have found intimidating. After retiring, she and her husband, Brian Hooker, decided to pursue a dream that many people only talk about. Rather than settling into a traditional retirement, they chose a life at sea. The couple moved aboard their 46-foot Morgan sailboat, Soulmate, and spent years sailing through the waters of Florida and the Bahamas. Their floating home became the backdrop for a lifestyle centered on freedom, exploration, and adventure. Online, that life appeared almost idyllic. Photos and videos shared on social media showed calm anchorages, tropical sunsets, quiet beaches, and the day-to-day realities of living aboard a sailboat. To those following their journey, the Hookers appeared to have left behind the routines of ordinary life in exchange for something many people dream of, but few ever experience. But while sailing became a defining chapter of Lynette's life, it wasn't what defined her as a person. Family remained at the center of everything she did. Her daughter, Carly, remained one of the most important people in her life, and despite spending much of her time on the water, Lynette stayed closely connected with her family back in the United States. Those relationships would later become crucial, as it was her loved ones who began raising questions when the official explanation for her disappearance failed to make sense. Lynette had also been married to Brian Hooker for more than 2 decades. Together, they had built a life that many viewed as unconventional but enviable, a retirement spent sailing from island to island aboard Soulmate. From the outside, it looked like they had escaped ordinary life. But as investigators would eventually discover, appearances don't always tell the full story. In the months following Lynette's disappearance, a very different picture of that marriage would begin to emerge, one that investigators could not afford to ignore. For years, the life Lynette and Brian Hooker shared appeared remarkably simple. They had traded traditional retirement for life aboard Soulmate, documenting sunsets, quiet anchorages, and the freedom that comes with living almost entirely at sea. To friends, followers, and even many family members, they seemed to be living a dream that most people never get the chance to experience. But as investigators began looking deeper after Lynette's disappearance, they weren't focused on social media posts. They were focused on the marriage itself. According to family members, concerns about the relationship had existed long before Lynette vanished. Those concerns would later become part of a much broader effort by investigators to understand the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Public records show that the couple had experienced legal trouble in the past. In 2017, Brian Hooker was arrested following a domestic incident involving Lynette. Court records indicate the case was later dismissed after Lynette declined to cooperate with prosecutors. That dismissal did not establish that the allegations were false, nor did it establish Brian's guilt. It simply meant the criminal case did not move forward. Years later, after Lynette disappeared, members of her family publicly described a relationship they say was far more complicated than it appeared from the outside. In interviews, Lynette's mother and stepfather said they believed she had endured difficult periods during the marriage. They also described occasions when they became concerned for her well-being, concerns they say became even more significant after she vanished. Investigators would also examine these earlier incidents as part of the broader timeline, not because a prior dispute proves what happened years later, but because understanding a relationship often means examining its entire history. At the same time, it's important to separate public allegations from established facts. As of this point in the investigation, Brian Hooker has consistently denied any wrongdoing, and the circumstances surrounding Lynette's disappearance remain under investigation. The existence of past disputes does not, by itself, determine what happened in the Bahamas. Still, investigators had a responsibility to examine every available piece of information. Because once questions began to emerge about what happened on the water that night, every part of the couple's history took on new significance. No one imagined those cracks would eventually become the center of an international investigation. On the evening of April 4, 2026, Lynette and Brian Hooker were anchored near Royal Island in the Bahamas, where they had been living aboard their sailboat, Soulmate. According to Brian's account, the evening began like many others. The couple had dinner together aboard the sailboat before deciding to take their inflatable dinghy ashore. It wasn't an unusual trip. For people living aboard sailboats, using a dinghy to travel between the boat and land is part of everyday life. The weather that evening was reported to be calm enough for the short journey, and nothing initially suggested that the trip would end in tragedy. According to Brian, the two set off in the dinghy toward shore. At some point during the trip, he told investigators that Lynette suddenly fell into the water. Brian said he immediately tried to help her. He told authorities he attempted to pull her back into the dinghy, but was unsuccessful. He also said Lynette wasn't wearing a life jacket, and that, despite his efforts, she disappeared beneath the water before he could rescue her. What happened over the next several minutes would become one of the most closely examined parts of the entire investigation. Brian told investigators that after losing sight of Lynette, he continued searching for her from the dinghy. When he was unable to find her, he made the decision to head for shore. According to his statement, he paddled the dinghy to land and sought help as quickly as he could. Local authorities were notified, and what initially appeared to be a missing person emergency quickly turned into a large-scale search operation. Responders from the Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, local Marine units, and later the United States Coast Guard began searching the surrounding waters, hoping Lynette could still be found alive. At that stage of the investigation, there was little reason for authorities to treat the case as anything other than a tragic accident at sea. Brian's account provided investigators with a timeline, a location, and an explanation for Lynette's disappearance. But as detectives began verifying those details against physical evidence, witness information, and later, digital data, they discovered that answering one question only raised several more. The investigation was no longer focused solely on finding Lynette. It was beginning to focus on whether everything that happened that night unfolded the way it had been described. Once Brian Hooker reported that Lynette had disappeared in the water, authorities launched an extensive search operation. What began as a race against time quickly grew into a coordinated effort involving multiple agencies from both the Bahamas and the United States. The Royal Bahamas Police Force took the lead in the investigation, while the Royal Bahamas Defense Force deployed Marine units to search the waters around Royal Island. As the operation expanded, the United States Coast Guard also joined the effort, bringing additional personnel and specialized search capabilities. For days, crews searched the area by air and sea. Helicopters flew repeated search patterns over the surrounding islands and open water. Patrol boats covered miles of coastline, while search aircraft scanned the ocean from above, looking for any sign of Lynette or evidence that could help determine what had happened. Search teams concentrated on the waters surrounding Royal Island, carefully examining the area where Brian said Lynette had entered the ocean. Rescue crews also considered tides, currents, and weather conditions to estimate where someone in the water could have drifted. As each day passed, the search area continued to expand. Search and rescue operations are designed to locate survivors as quickly as possible. But with every passing hour, the chances of finding someone alive become increasingly remote. Investigators must begin balancing the search for a survivor with the recovery of evidence that could explain what happened. For Lynette's family, those early days were filled with uncertainty. They held on to hope that she would somehow be found alive. At the same time, they were forced to confront a possibility that no family ever wants to consider. The operation that had begun as a rescue mission was slowly becoming a recovery effort. Despite the scale of the search, no trace of Lynette was found. No confirmed sightings, no personal belongings floating in the water, no evidence that could immediately explain how she had disappeared. For investigators, the absence of answers was becoming just as important as the evidence they were searching for. Because if Lynette had entered the water where Brian said she did, one question became increasingly difficult to ignore. Why had such an extensive search failed to find any trace of her? That question would soon push investigators beyond search and rescue and into a far more complex criminal investigation. In the days after Lynette Hooker's disappearance, investigators continued treating the case as an active missing person investigation. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed Brian Hooker's account, and began reconstructing the couple's movements before and after Lynette was reported missing. At the same time, Lynette's family was trying to make sense of what they had been told. Among those searching for answers was her daughter, Carly. From the beginning, Carly publicly questioned whether the events described by Brian fully explained what had happened that night. She urged investigators to examine every detail carefully and repeatedly emphasized that her mother knew the risks of living on the water after years of sailing. Those concerns alone weren't evidence, but they reflected questions that investigators were already working to answer. As detectives continued piecing together the timeline, they began comparing Brian's statements with physical evidence, witness interviews, and other information collected during the investigation. That's when the case began to shift. Authorities have not publicly disclosed every inconsistency they identified. However, court documents and later investigative updates indicate that detectives found aspects of the reported timeline that required closer examination. Rather than accepting the initial account at face value, investigators started testing it against the available evidence. That process is standard in any major investigation. Detectives don't determine whether a statement is accurate based on how convincing it sounds. They determine whether it can be supported by independent evidence. As the investigation progressed, Bahamian authorities detained Brian Hooker for questioning. His detention marked a significant development, signaling that investigators believed additional interviews and investigative steps were necessary. But just as important is what happened next. Brian was later released, and as of the time of this investigation, no criminal charges have been filed against him in connection with Lynette's disappearance. Throughout the investigation, Brian has denied any wrongdoing, and authorities have continued describing the case as an active investigation. For Lynette's family, the lack of immediate answers was difficult to accept. The extensive search had produced no sign of Lynette. The timeline was being scrutinized. Investigators were asking more questions than they were answering. It became increasingly clear that resolving this case would depend on more than witness statements alone. Investigators weren't relying on instinct. They were looking for evidence. As investigators continued reviewing the case, their focus expanded beyond interviews and witness statements. They turned to something that often plays a critical role in modern criminal investigations: digital evidence. Cell phones, GPS devices, smartwatches, and other electronic equipment can create detailed records of a person's movements. Even when there are no eyewitnesses, those digital records can help investigators establish timelines, verify locations, and determine whether a sequence of events matches what has been reported. In a case like Lynette Hooker's, where there were no independent witnesses to her disappearance, that type of evidence became especially important. Authorities began analyzing electronic data connected to the investigation, including location information capable of helping reconstruct the couple's movements before and after Lynette was reported missing. Investigators have not publicly released every detail of that analysis. However, officials have confirmed that information obtained from electronic devices played a significant role in the direction of the investigation. According to investigators, that evidence pointed them toward areas that had not been the primary focus of the original search. That development marked a turning point. The investigation was no longer relying solely on Brian Hooker's account of where Lynette entered the water. Detectives were now comparing that account with objective data collected from electronic devices. When those two don't align, investigators have an obligation to find out why. Digital location evidence is often used to reconstruct events minute by minute. Depending on the device, it can record travel routes, timestamps, changes in direction, speed, and periods when a device remains stationary. On its own, that information doesn't prove a crime occurred. But when combined with physical evidence, witness statements, and forensic analysis, it can help investigators determine whether a reported timeline is consistent with the available facts. In Lynette's case, investigators believed the digital evidence justified taking another look at the area surrounding her disappearance. Months after the initial search had ended, the United States Coast Guard returned to the Bahamas alongside Bahamian authorities for a new, highly specialized operation. This wasn't a repeat of the original search. It was a targeted mission based on new investigative leads. The goal was no longer just to search the water. It was to determine whether the evidence could reveal what really happened on the night Lynette disappeared. That renewed operation would become one of the most significant developments in the entire investigation. Months after the initial search had ended, investigators made a decision that immediately drew renewed attention to the case. The United States Coast Guard announced it would return to the Bahamas to support Bahamian authorities in a new phase of the investigation into Lynette Hooker's disappearance. Unlike the first operation, this wasn't a broad search covering miles of open water. It was a carefully planned mission involving specialized personnel and advanced forensic technology. Divers were deployed to examine areas that investigators believed warranted a closer look beneath the surface. A specially trained cadaver dog was brought in to assist search teams in detecting the scent of human remains, even in challenging marine environments. While these dogs are an important investigative resource, an alert alone is not considered evidence. Any indication must be supported through further forensic examination. Investigators also used underwater drones and remotely operated vehicles, commonly known as ROVs, to search locations that would have been difficult or unsafe for divers to inspect thoroughly. Equipped with high-definition cameras, these systems allow investigators to document underwater conditions and examine areas with a level of precision that wasn't always possible during the initial search. At the same time, investigators seized the inflatable dinghy that Brian Hooker said the couple had been using on the night Lynette disappeared. Rather than treating it simply as a piece of property, investigators treated it as potential evidence. The dinghy was taken for forensic examination, where specialists could inspect it for trace evidence, evaluate its condition, and compare physical findings with the timeline investigators had been developing throughout the case. The operation reflected close cooperation between the United States Coast Guard, the Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and other investigative partners working to determine exactly what happened on April 4. Officials have not publicly disclosed every piece of evidence collected during the mission. However, they confirmed that investigators recovered items they considered relevant to the ongoing investigation, and that those materials would undergo further forensic analysis. For Lynette's family, the renewed search represented something they had been hoping for since the beginning. It meant the investigation was still moving forward. Authorities had not given up, but as the operation came to an end, investigators were forced to confront the same heartbreaking reality that had followed the case from the very beginning. Despite days of searching with divers, cadaver dogs, underwater technology, and specialized investigative teams, Lynette Hooker was still missing. Her remains had not been found. For most families, that would feel like another devastating setback. For investigators, however, the mission wasn't measured solely by whether they found Lynette. It was measured by what the evidence could reveal. Because in a complex investigation, recovering a body is only one part of finding the truth. The forensic work was far from over. As investigators continued analyzing evidence, Lynette Hooker's family found themselves living through a different kind of investigation. One measured not in search grids or forensic reports, but in unanswered questions. Every new development brought hope. Every day without answers brought another wave of uncertainty. For Lynette's mother, Darlene, the hardest part wasn't simply that her daughter was missing. It was not knowing what had happened to her. In interviews following the renewed search, Darlene spoke openly about the emotional weight her family had been carrying since April. Despite everything that had happened, she refused to give up hope that the investigation would eventually uncover the truth. She acknowledged the heartbreak of not having Lynette home, but she also expressed confidence that investigators were committed to following the evidence wherever it led. For Lynette's stepfather, Bill, the loss was deeply personal. At one point during the interview, his emotions became impossible to hide. He referred to Lynette simply as "my baby." It wasn't a statement about the investigation. It wasn't about evidence. It was a father grieving the absence of someone he loved. Moments like that serve as a reminder that behind every headline is a family forced to live with questions that no one has yet been able to answer. While investigators analyze timelines and examine forensic evidence, families experience the investigation very differently. Every phone call creates hope, every official update brings anxiety, and every day without answers can feel longer than the last. Throughout the investigation, Darlene and Bill have continued to support law enforcement's efforts while urging anyone with information to come forward. They've consistently expressed their belief that the truth will eventually come to light, even if that process takes time. For them, this case has never been about speculation or public attention. It's about bringing Lynette home, and if that's no longer possible, it's about making sure her family finally learns what happened. Because while search operations may end and headlines eventually fade, the families of missing loved ones continue living with the uncertainty every single day. For Lynette's family, the investigation isn't measured by news conferences or search missions. It's measured by one question that still hasn't been answered. What happened to Lynette Hooker? And investigators believe the answer may lie not in emotion or speculation, but in the evidence they've spent months carefully assembling. One question has followed this case almost from the beginning. If Lynette Hooker's remains are never found, can anyone still be held legally responsible? The short answer is yes. But proving a homicide without recovering a victim's body is one of the most challenging tasks prosecutors can face. Many people assume that a murder case can't move forward unless investigators first recover human remains. That's a common misconception. While recovering a body can provide critical forensic evidence, it's not a legal requirement for a homicide prosecution. Instead, investigators look at the totality of the evidence. That can include witness statements, digital records, forensic examinations, physical evidence, surveillance footage, financial activity, phone data, and any inconsistencies that emerge during the investigation. Rather than relying on one piece of evidence, investigators work to determine whether all of those pieces fit together into a clear and reliable picture of what happened. In cases where a body is never recovered, every detail becomes even more significant. The timeline, electronic data, forensic findings, statements made by the people involved. Each piece is carefully compared against the others to see whether they support or contradict the known facts. That's one reason investigators often spend months and sometimes years building complex cases before deciding whether enough evidence exists to seek criminal charges. It's a process that requires patience, thoroughness, and a high legal standard. Importantly, the absence of charges at any given stage does not necessarily mean an investigation has reached its conclusion. Likewise, it does not mean charges are inevitable. Investigators continue gathering evidence until they believe they have reached the point where the facts support a clear legal decision, whatever that decision may ultimately be. In Lynette Hooker's case, authorities have continued describing the investigation as active. As of this documentary, no criminal charges have been filed, and investigators have not publicly disclosed all of the evidence they've collected or the conclusions they've reached. That distinction matters. An active investigation is not the same as a completed one. For Lynette's family, the legal process may still have a long road ahead, but they continue to hold on to the hope that, whether through new forensic findings, digital evidence, or future investigative breakthroughs, the full truth of what happened will eventually come to light. Because in cases like this, justice isn't defined by how quickly investigators reach an answer. It's defined by getting the answer right. For investigators, The renewed search wasn't the end of the story. It was another step toward finding answers. Although the operation concluded without locating Lynette Hooker's remains, officials made one thing clear: the investigation is far from over. The evidence recovered during the search didn't go straight into storage. It went to forensic specialists. Every item collected has the potential to answer a question investigators have been asking since April 4th. Does the physical evidence support the timeline, or does it point somewhere else? Among the most important pieces of evidence is the inflatable dinghy Brian Hooker said the couple was using the night Lynette disappeared. Investigators seized the vessel during the renewed operation and continue to examine it using forensic techniques designed to identify details that aren't always visible during an initial inspection. Sometimes those examinations confirm an account. Other times, they raise entirely new questions. At this stage, authorities have not publicly disclosed the results of those examinations. That's not unusual. Investigators often withhold key findings while an active case is still developing, particularly when releasing certain details could compromise future interviews or investigative steps. The same applies to the digital evidence that helped bring investigators back to the Bahamas. Officials have confirmed that electronic data played a role in shaping the renewed search, but they have not revealed everything they've learned or everything they're still analyzing. For now, much of that information remains known only to investigators. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies in both the Bahamas and the United States continue working together as the case moves forward. Authorities have repeatedly encouraged anyone with information, no matter how small it may seem, to come forward. In complex investigations, even a single overlooked detail can help investigators connect pieces that previously didn't fit. One question many viewers continue to ask is whether anyone has been charged. As of the publication of this documentary, the answer is no. Brian Hooker has denied any wrongdoing, and based on current public reporting, no criminal charges have been filed against him in connection with Lynette Hooker's disappearance. That doesn't mean investigators have reached a final conclusion, and it doesn't mean charges will eventually be filed. It means the investigation remains active, and authorities continue to evaluate the evidence before making any legal decisions. For Lynette's family, that process can feel painfully slow. Every update offers a measure of hope. Every unanswered question reminds them that their search for the truth isn't over. And for investigators, patience is often one of the most important tools they have. Cases like this aren't solved by assumptions. They're solved by evidence. By carefully testing every statement, every timeline, every forensic result, every digital record, until the facts lead them to one conclusion, and one conclusion only. For now, one fact remains unchanged. Lynette Hooker has never been found. Her family is still waiting for answers. And the investigation into what happened that night in the Bahamas continues. Some mysteries grow colder with time. This one hasn't. With every new piece of evidence, every forensic examination, and every investigative step, authorities move one step closer to understanding what happened aboard Soulmate. Whether that journey ultimately leads to criminal charges, a definitive explanation, or long-awaited closure for Lynette's family remains unknown. But until investigators finish following the evidence wherever it leads, Lynette Hooker's story is still being written. Long before investigators searched the waters of the Bahamas, long before forensic teams examined evidence, and long before her name appeared in headlines across the country, Lynette Hooker was simply a woman living the life she had worked decades to build. After retiring, she and Brian set out aboard Soulmate, embracing a lifestyle that many people only dream about. Their days were filled with open water, quiet anchorages, and the promise of discovering somewhere new beyond the horizon. To those watching from the outside, it looked like freedom, a retirement defined by adventure, a life without schedules, a dream finally realized. Today, Soulmate represents something very different. Not just the place Lynette once called home, but the place where a family's life changed forever. For her mother Darlene, her stepfather Bill, her daughter Carly, and everyone who knew and loved her, the search has never truly ended. While investigators continue examining evidence and following every credible lead, Lynette's family continues living with the uncertainty that comes from not knowing exactly what happened to someone they love. That uncertainty is one of the hardest burdens any family can carry. It's why cases involving missing persons often remain open for years. Not because investigators stopped searching, but because every unanswered question deserves an answer grounded in evidence, not assumptions. As of today, the investigation remains active. Authorities continue asking anyone with information to come forward. Brian Hooker has denied any wrongdoing, and no criminal charges have been filed in connection with Lynette's disappearance. Where the evidence ultimately leads is a question only investigators can answer. But one thing is already certain. Lynette Hooker's story is about far more than an unsolved investigation. It's about a daughter, a mother, a wife, a friend, a woman whose life mattered long before the world learned her name. Some mysteries fade with time. This one has only grown more urgent. Until investigators uncover exactly what happened on that April evening in the Bahamas, Lynette Hooker's story remains unfinished. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime investigations. And if you have thoughts on this case or information you'd like to discuss respectfully, let us know in the comments below. Because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every family deserves answers.